So today we're going to start factoring, and we're going to look at basic polynomials today where our leading coefficient, which is the number out front, is a 1. Okay, if it's not a 1, we have to make it a 1, and that's where GCF would come into play, which we learned last week. So we have standard form x squared plus bx plus c, right, highest exponent to constant, and it only can be a quadratic, so the highest exponent can only be a 2 for us to factor with the method that we're using today. If it's not a 2, you need to look for GCF. I don't think I'm going to give you that or not, though, at this point. I'm going to start basic. Okay? So when we are factoring, we're going to use our x, and we are looking for two numbers that multiply to 1 times that c. So whatever 1 times c is, 1 times c is what we're looking for. Two numbers that multiply to that number. And then we're looking for the same two numbers that add to our b term. So this term down here is going to be b. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to c and add to b. And remember I talked about factoring going backwards. So we started with something like x plus 2 times x plus 3. This is known as factored form. Okay, that's my factored form. Now, over the last month, we foiled or boxed that. Thank you. You're welcome. And when we foiled or boxed, we got x squared plus 5x plus 6. What form is that? Standard form. So over the last month, we've gone from factored form to standard form. Now we're going to go from standard form to factored form. So we're working backwards. Okay. But again, we're going to use our x. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to c and then add to b. So let's try one. So x squared plus 11x plus 30. So I'm going to create my x. And some of you, once you see what we're doing, can probably do this lesson without drawing the x, and I'm okay with that. But if you like the organization, then kind of like the box method. Some of you can foil, some of you like the box for the organization. This is more for organization. Okay? So what goes in on top of the x? According to my x up here. 30. It's 1 times 30. Okay, so 30 goes on top. And what goes on the bottom? 11, your b term. Okay, that looks like the game we played on Friday. What two numbers multiply to 30 and then add to 11?
5, 6, and 5.
I'm going to do a different color. 6 and 5. It doesn't matter which side you put the 5 on and which side you put the 6 on. 6 times 5 is 30. 6 plus 5 is 11. We're okay filling in the x? Now remember, we're going from standard form to factored form. These are our factors. So we're going to take what's here that we just found and write it in parentheses. So x plus 6 and x plus 5. Now if you foiled that out in your head or you boxed it, you end up with x squared plus 11x plus 30. But that is your final answer. Bless you. Yes, Mackenzie.
So there's an imaginary 1?
Yeah, so if there's not a number in front of a variable, there's always a 1 there. We're going to eventually have numbers that are greater than 1 here, and we'll learn how to factor those, but we're going to start with this. Okay, let's try another one together, and then I'm going to give you 2 to try on your own. So x squared minus 13x minus 30. So again, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to 1 times c, and 1 times c is negative 30. And then what goes on the bottom? Negative 13. So two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to negative 13. So let's start here. What are two numbers that multiply to 30? 10 and 3. Okay, here's what I'm going to do real quick. I'm going to just write it over here. So 10 times 3 gives me 30, right? Is there any way, but I need it to be a negative 30. So which one are we going to make negative? The 10? Okay. Is negative 10 plus 3 negative 13? No. What if I make the 3 negative? Is 10 minus 3 13? Is there anything else that multiplies to 30? 15 and 2? Which one do you think needs to be negative? The 15. Negative 15 times 2 is negative 30. Negative 15 plus 2 is negative 13. So the first numbers you think of, or the most obvious that you think of, might not always be the case, which is why you need to go back and check that it actually multiplies and adds correctly. So again, negative 15 times 2 is negative 30. Negative 15 plus 2 is negative 13. And then we write that in parentheses. So x minus 15 times x plus 2. Are you okay with that? Okay, why don't you try these two? So what goes on the top of my x? 12. 1 times c. What goes on the bottom? Negative 8. So I am looking for two numbers that multiply to 12 and then add to negative 8. Mackenzie? Negative 6 and negative 2. Negative 6 times negative 2 is positive 12. Negative 6 minus 2 is a negative 8. I thought initially when I saw 12, I was like, okay, 3 and 4. But that doesn't add to 8. So that's what you're looking for. Your final answer is x minus 6 times x minus 2. Or x minus 2 times x minus 6. It doesn't matter what order they go in. Okay. Number 4, what goes on the top of my x? Negative 15. On the bottom of my x? Negative 2. So two numbers that multiply to negative 15 and add to negative 2. Which one's negative?
5.
The 5. Negative 5 times 3 is negative 15. Negative 5 plus 3 gives me negative 2. Final answer, x minus 5 times x plus 3. How'd you do on those? Good? Okay, so I want to look at something slightly different, and I want you to tell me how this is different. So I have 2x squared plus 30x plus 108. There's a 2 out front, right? And we said we're factoring only if there's a 1 out front. So always, 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 when you start factoring, the first thing you should look for is greatest common factor. Can I pull anything out to make my life easier?
Yes.
A 2. Everything is divisible by 2, right? So I'm going to start by pulling out a 2, which leaves me x squared plus 15x plus 54. Can you now factor x squared plus 15x plus 54? Okay, so I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 54 and add to 15. So let's start. What are two numbers that multiply to 54? 6 and 9. Is 9 plus 6 15?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So 6 times 9 is 54. 9 plus 6 is 15. So in factored form, it's x plus 9 times x plus 6. And what do you think I do with that 2? You leave it on the outside of the parentheses. It is still part of your factoring. That's just your GCF. Okay, that stays on the outside. I'm going to give you one like this, and then we will be done with notes. So why don't you do this one? Okay, so take a second and complete this one. All right, where'd we start?
Distributed or divided.
So we factor out their greatest common factor, which is 3. When I pull out a 3, I'm left with x squared minus 13x plus 12. Okay. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to negative 13. So let's start with my multiples of 12. What two numbers multiply to 12? You guys are ahead of the game. 12 and 1? But I need them to both be negative because I need this to be a negative 13. Negative 12 times negative 1 is a positive 12. Negative 12 minus 1 is negative 13. Okay? If you didn't see that right away, you might want to create a chart like we did up here, where you write out the factors and see which ones work. So like that didn't work, that one does. That might be just another way to organize if you don't see it. So I have x minus 12 times x minus 1 with the 3 on the outside. You cannot lose that 3. How do we feel about our first round of factoring? Not too bad? Awesome. Any questions, comments, or concerns?